Conversations. I'm Sarah Colvin. Time for a legislative update, and I'm very pleased to welcome in studio Senator Julian Cyr, of course, representing the Cape and Islands. Senator Julian, thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
Happy New Year.
Yes, of course. Happy 2019.
Just getting on 2019. So heard yesterday, great news, and it's so fresh that I have to have my piece of paper in front of me. You got some committee assignments, and you were named the Assistant Majority Whip. What does that mean?
What does that mean? So this is it's quite a big deal. So the Senate President, we have a new Senate President, Karen Spilka, who's just starting her first full term. She's marvelous and wonderful, and just a really strong leader, a social worker by training, just someone who really understands how do you look out for people, and then also how do you build relationships and negotiate with people. That's sort of the job that we have as lawmakers on Beacon Hill. And so she named her leadership team, and so it's a group of 8 other senators who make up the core of her leadership, so who are going to help determine the direction of the Senate, what are our priorities, how do we address a whole various range of issues from healthcare to housing affordability to mental health parity. And so as the Assistant Majority Whip, I'm part of that. Whips traditionally help basically do vote counting and figuring out where you take the temperature and the pulse of the membership to see where the membership of the Democratic caucus and also more broadly the Senate, where that is. So I'll be in, we have morning meetings, to sort of determine the course in the Senate, and I'll be in the mix, which is it's a pretty big honor.
Yeah.
Sophomore lawmakers, I'm in my second term, typically aren't asked to be in leadership. So it's certainly something I'm very grateful for.
And you're also the youngest member of the Senate, correct?
Yes, I'm the youngest. I was the youngest of the member of the Senate last term, and fortunately, I'm a little older, but I'm still the youngest member. Although we do have a good crop of millennial lawmakers in the Senate and in the House. But I'm the only member in leadership.
Fantastic.
I should add too, now we're at a point where, with this appointment for me, Representative Sarah Peake also was appointed in leadership in the House. So Cape Cod, among the top 9 lawmakers in both chambers, Cape Cod has a seat in both of those chambers. That's really significant for a tiny little region. There's only 8 of us who represent Cape Cod and the islands out of 200 members. We were talking earlier. That's actually more representation than actually Western Mass has on those leadership
Which is
teams.
Amazing for us here in Cape Cod, because I think when I've talked to your predecessors and other members of the legislature, it's difficult to get funding for the Cape because it's that perception that we're wealthy and it's vacation land and all of that. So really, to get the money that we need to solve those issues is important. So I'm hoping that with your and Sarah Peake's leadership, that we'll get a little better.
Yeah, and we have this whole great delegation that all kind of pulls in the same direction. But really having that ability to, when you're talking about an issue, we're going to take up healthcare reform, I think, right? I'll be able, to have the Senate President's ear, on all these things, how we're looking at a whole host of big challenges, how that impacts Cape Cod, how that impacts Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and to be sort of early in that conversation. Hopefully it's helpful. It also means more work, but I've never been shy about doing more work.
We love that.
Yeah. So.
And so, of course, you're also going to be chairing the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Use, and Recovery. Again, huge for us here on the Cape. Talk to me a little bit about that committee assignment.
So this has become a really important committee given the opiate epidemic that the state has been grappling with now. We're kind of 14, 15, 16 years on. The last 2 sessions, every session we've passed a major piece of legislation related to opioids. I expect we'll do that again. Another really big priority for me, and also a big priority for the Senate President, I mentioned she was a social worker by training, is mental health and mental health access and parity. Cape Codders know we don't do a great job of that in the state.
No.
Frankly, since we moved away from a more institutional model in the 70s and 80s, we've had what are called community-based mental health services. There's a whole host of gaps. Access is a huge challenge, and getting parity, actually insurance coverage, is also a major challenge. So this is a significant priority in the Senate, in the legislature, and so I'll be leading the Senate's effort on that. I also sit on the 2 other healthcare committees. We have a public health committee and a healthcare financing committee. I'm on all of those, so any kind of healthcare issue, I'll be in the mix of that. We also expect education reform, and particularly funding for education is a big challenge. There's a lot of talk about doing something on that this session. I sit on the education committee, and I'm also serving on as vice chair of housing, which I can talk about housing issues.
Yeah,
if you want.
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, education, just to stay on that for a second, I've seen so many contentious school committee meetings lately, with Dennis and Yarmouth fighting over funding for schools, Barnstable looking at cutting some of its programs. So certainly kind of finding a way for the schools to get the funding they need as the environment changes. I mean, it is not cheap to educate kids these days.
Well, and historically, because the way that Chapter 70, which is our funding formula, how it's structured, a big portion of that is based on property taxes. We've got a significant mismatch here between the lived experiences and also just the wealth or lack thereof of people who live here year round and what our property values are worth. So we're trying to figure out. We've already met with the school superintendents. We're actually pulling together a working group to really sink our teeth into the various proposals. The governor's filed a bill. There's a Promise Act that's filed by Senator Chang Diaz. There's also another bill, Representative Paul Tucker from Salem has filed. So there's these three kind of bills in the mix. We're going to sit down with our school superintendents and school committee members and figure out what pieces are most important. Is that more resources for English language learners, which increasingly we have more and more needs for? Is it help with health insurance costs for schools? Another big piece that we've been pushing is rural school aid. My colleague, Senator Adam Hines, who represents the Berkshires, so another far-flung part of the Commonwealth, he's led on this rural school aid package. We're going to try to get that through. So it's a very complicated topic. I joke that there's very few people who understand this. Actually, someone who really understands this really well is former Representative Cleon Turner.
I was just
he's probably in those like 10 people in the state who really understands the formula and how it works or doesn't work. So it's good to have a seat on that and to be able to be part of the conversation around education and education funding. Of course, this all comes down to revenue. We are underfunding our schools by over $1 billion.
My goodness.
We actually think it's closer to $2 billion. There's a proposal for a fair share amendment around asking millionaires and billionaires to pay a little more, which would generate that revenue. We had hoped to get that on the ballot in 2018. There was some constitutionality issues with the Supreme Court. It didn't make it to the ballot. So we're starting that over again. Senator Jason Lewis has filed the fair share amendment again, and it likely will go to the ballot in 2022. But until then, right, if you've been underfunding education for so long, where you're going to get over $1 billion?
Right.
That's a big chunk of money, and if you don't have new revenue in the mix, how do you do that? So that's
exactly.
some of what we will be grappling with education.
Sure, and you're vice chair of the Committee on Housing as well. Again, such an important issue for us here on the Cape as we look at zoning changes, density changes, all of the things we need to make the housing market a little more appealing.
Yeah. Well, we've got what we have on Cape. We have this out of whack real estate market, right? Because we have this second home or third home market. It's really escalated property values, and it's just meant that for middle class and working class folks on Cape Cod, it's just harder and harder to get access to housing. What I've been trying to do, so there's a broader effort. We haven't kept up with housing production in the Commonwealth and in Greater Boston. A lot of that has to do with we've got a lot of small parochial towns. They've not kept up with housing production. They need some sort of zoning reform. I'm trying to make sure that in that conversation, there's going to be this larger conversation about needs in Greater Boston, transit-oriented development, a whole host of things along that front, which are good and important, but that the needs of our communities, we need some unique things on housing that look a little different from Greater Boston.
Absolutely.
So I filed a bill called an act relative to attainable housing in seasonal communities, and it takes 12 various ideas that we've heard from constituents on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket, meeting with developers and realtors and public housing advocates and planners, town managers, and it's a whole host of various proposals that we're trying to get on the table. We're trying to get vetted by the committees so that when we have an opportunity, and I think we'll take up a housing production bill,
sure,
that some of those ideas are in the mix. I don't know if we'll get all of them, and some of them are really common sense and pretty basic, and others of them are a little more nuanced or controversial. But in really trying to make sure that our colleagues understand that if we're going to really address housing production all across the Commonwealth, what Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket need are going to be a little different than sort of the broader conversation in Boston.
Absolutely. So that's just one of the more than 70 bills that you have filed. Do you
73,
sleep, Julian? 73 bills. Maybe we're not going to go through all of them,
No,
obviously.
please don't. I haven't yet
Give me the
and there's all
details.
these they all have
My
different
paper's
bill
not that big.
numbers and they change.
Exactly.
And really trying to say, one, various ideas that come to us from constituents, and people raise all sorts of interesting issues. One that's arisen related to the opioid epidemic is increasingly you have grandparents who are raising grandchildren because their parent, the parents of these children are in recovery or they're in the throes of the epidemic. And there's actually a lot of hurdles in the current system we have for next of kin or grandparents to take care of those children. So we got a bill on that. Seasonal housing affordability, looking at how do you help keep seniors in their homes a little longer. A whole myriad of things, Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, a whole bunch of bills around clean energy, and how do you really move towards a clean energy economy? Yes, allowing municipalities to opt in to buy more clean energy. Another bill around addressing solar panels in historic districts, which we've got plenty of those here.
Yes.
And it's a challenge. So there's a whole myriad, and we probably don't have time to go through all of them, but have really tried to identify the issues that Cape Codders have brought to us to put them in legislation and get those conversations started
Right, kind of
across
make it
the
a
various
little easier
committees.
for people to connect with the green energy. Again, I'm thinking about the folks that live in historic district and having to go to multiple approval processes in some places, not even being able to take advantage of that because of where they live.
Yeah, so this was a bill that we started with some constituents from the UU Church in Barnstable Village who were trying to actually put solar panels on their church and were running into some hurdles. They actually were able to they actually ended up getting the solar panels on, but it raised that, there's a whole host of challenges and there's no very clear guidance from the state to historic district commissions around how do you make sure that you're preserving and protecting historic integrity, but also making way for sort of the next wave of how we're going to power our homes.
Right.
We allow power lines currently, which are not the most sightly elements and not necessarily historic. So providing that guidance, but that was an idea that came from Sheila Place and a few other constituents in Yarmouth and Barnstable that we were able to put into legislation.
Great. Anything else, Julian, going on up in Beacon Hill? Obviously you're very busy.
We've got a whole host of things going on, and I would just encourage constituents to reach out. We've got a whole list on senatorshere.com of legislation that we filed. What'll happen now that committees have been appointed. Bills are going to be assigned to those committees. There'll be hearings over about the next 6-9 months. We have an early February 2020 deadline to render decisions on legislation, and it goes from the process through there. Legislating is a very iterative process. Thousands and thousands of bills have been filed. Not all of those are going to be passed.
Of course.
But certainly we really try to make sure that the interests of Cape Codders and Islanders are in the mix. We're just trying to keep up our track record. We've got some big accomplishments from last session, particularly the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund.
Very excited about that.
Very keenly interested in working on how we implement that now. So a lot going on, but a lot of exciting stuff. But just really encouraging people to reach out to us if there's something we missed, or if they've got another idea, or they want to get involved. We could use all the help we can get.
Fantastic. Well, Julian, thank you so much, as
Always
always,
a
for
pleasure.
stopping
Thank
by.
you.
Hopefully it won't be too long until we see you again.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Julian Cyr, of course, is the senator for the Cape and Islands District, state senator. You can follow him online at senatorcyr.com. For Cape Media News, I'm Sarah Colvin.